Tattoo, reported Fishig. Imperial Eagle, left shoulder. Crude. Old. Letters underneath it. Capital S, period. Capital I, period. Capital I. Capital X. I just found the signet ring in the bag. Gold, with a wheat ear motif. S-I-I-X, said Amos. Sameter Infantry 9. The 9th Sameter Infantry had been founded in Urbitane 23 years before, and had served, as Amos had already told me, in the brutal liberation war on Surrealis 6. According to city records, 519 veterans of that war and that regiment had been repatriated to Sameter after mustering out 13 years ago, coming back from the horrors of war to an increasingly depressed world beset by the blight of poverty and urban collapse. Their regimental emblem, as befitted a world once dominated by agriculture, was the wheat ear. They came back 13 years ago. The oldest victim we have dates from that time, said Fishig. Surrealis 6 was a hard campaign, wasn't it? I asked. Amos nodded. The enemy was dug in. It was ferocious, brutal, brutalizing. And the climate. 2 white dwarf suns, no cloud cover. The most punishing heat and light, not to mention ultraviolet burning. Ruins the skin, I murmured. Makes it weather-beaten and prematurely aged. Everyone looked at the taut, lined face of the body on the slab. I'll get a list of the veterans, volunteered Rex. I already have one, said Amos. I'm betting you find the names Brel Sodakis and Vim Vennick on it, I said. Amos paused as he scanned. I do, he agreed. What about Quater Traves? Yes, he's here. Master Gunnery Sergeant Quater Traves. What about Omin Lund? Yes, sniper, first class. Invalided out of service. The Sameter 9th were a mixed unit, then? Asked Beckwin. All our guard foundings are, Rex said proudly. So, these men and women, Midas mused. Soldiers, been through hell, fighting the corruption. Your idea is they brought it back here with them. Some taint. You think they were infected by the touch of the warp on Surrealis and have been ritually killing as a way of worship back here ever since? No, I said. I think they're still fighting the war. It remains a sad truth of the Imperium that virtually no veteran ever comes back from fighting its wars intact. Combat alone shreds nerves and shatters bodies. But the horrors of the warp and of foul Xenos forms like the Tyrannid steal sanity forever and leave veterans fearing the shadows and the night and, sometimes, the nature of their friends and neighbors for the rest of their lives. The guards of the 9th Sameter Infantry had come home 13 years before, broke by a savage war against mankind's arch-enemy, and, through their scars and their fear, brought the war back with them. The RBTs mounted raids at once on the addresses of all the veterans on the list, those that could be traced, those that were still alive. It appeared that skin cancer had taken over 200 of them in the years since their repatriation. Surrealis had claimed them as surely as if they had fallen there in combat. A number were rounded up, bewildered drunks, cripples, addicts, a few honest men and women trying diligently to carry on with their lives. For those latter I felt especially sorry. But about 70 could not be traced. Many may have disappeared, moved on, or died without it coming to the attention of the authorities. But some had clearly fled. Lund, Traves, Sodakis, Vennick for starters. Their habs were found abandoned, strewn with possessions, as if the occupant had left in a hurry. So were the habs of 20 more belonging to names on the list. The RBTs arrived at the hab of one, ex-Corporal Geffin Sancto, in time to catch him in the act of flight. Sancto had been a flamer operator in the Guard, and like so many of his kind, had managed to keep his weapon as a memento. Screaming the battle cry of the Sameter 9th, he torched 4 RBTs in the stairwell of his building before the tactical squads of the judiciary vaporized him in a hail of gunshots. "Why are they killing?" Beckwin asked me. "All these years in secret ritual. I don't know. You do, Eisenhorn. You so do. Very well. I can guess. The fellow worker who jokes at the Emperor's expense and makes your fragile sanity imagine he is tainted with the warp. The rug maker whose patterns suggest to you the secret encoding of chaos symbols. The midwife you decide is spawning the offspring of the arch-enemy in the mid-rise maternity hall. The travelling evangelist who seems just too damn fired up to be safe. She looked down at the floor of the landspeeder. They see demons everywhere. In everything. In everyone. And so help them, they believe they are doing the Emperor's work by killing. They trust no one, so they daren't alert the authorities. They take the eyes, the hands, and the tongue, all the organs of communication, any way the arch-enemy might transmit his foul lies. And then they destroy the brain and heart, the organs which common soldier myth declares must harbour demons. "So where are we going now?" she asked. Another hunch. The guild hall of the Sameter Agricultural Fraternity was a massive ragstone building on Furnace Street, its facade decaying from the ministrations of smog and acid rain. It had been disused for over 2 decades. Its last duty had been to serve as a recruitment post of the Sameter Ninth during the founding. In its long hallways, the men and women of the Ninth had signed their names, collected their starchy new fatigues, and pledged their battle oath to the God Emperor of mankind. At certain times, under certain circumstances, when a proper altar to the Emperor is not available, guard officers improvise in order to conduct their ceremonies. An imperial eagle, an Aquila standard, is suspended from a wall, and a sacred spot is marked on the floor beneath in yellow chalk. The guild hall was not a consecrated building. The founding must have been the first time the young volunteers of Urbitane had seen that done. They'd made their vows to a yellow chalk cross and a dangling Aquila. Rex was leading 3 fire teams of armed Arbites, but I went in with Midas and Fishig first, quietly. Bequin and Amos stayed by our vehicle. Midas was carrying his matched needle pistols, and Fishig an auto shotgun. I clipped a slab-pattern magazine full of fresh rounds into the precious bolt pistol given to me by Librarian Britnoth of the Adeptus Astartes Death Watch chapter. We pushed open the boarded doors of the decaying structure and edged down the dank corridors. Rainwater pattered from the roof, and the marble floor was spotted and eaten by collected acid. We could hear the singing. A couple of dozen voices, voicing up the battle hymn of the Golden Throne. I led my companions forward, hunched low. Through the crazed windows of an inner door, we looked through into the main hall. 23 dishevelled veterans in ragged clothes were knelt down in ranks on the filthy floor. Their heads bowed to the rusty imperial eagle hanging on the wall as they sang. There was a yellow chalk cross on the floor under the Aquila. Each veteran had a backpack or rucksack and a weapon by their feet. My heart ached. This was how it had gone over 2 decades before, when they came to the service, young and fresh and eager, before the war, before the horror. "Let me try. Try to give them a chance," I said. "Gregor," Midas hissed. "Let me try. For their sake. Cover me." I slipped into the back of the hall, my gun lowered at my side, and joined in the verse. One by one, the voices died away, and bowed heads turned sideways to look at me. Down the aisle, at the chalk cross of the altar, Lund, Traves, and a bearded man I didn't know stood gazing at me. In the absence of other voices, I finished the hymn. "It's over," I said. "The war is over, and you have all done your duty, above and beyond the call." Silence. "I am Inquisitor Eisenhorn. I'm here to relieve you. The careful war against the blight of chaos that you have waged through Urbitane in secret is now over. The Inquisition is here to take over. You can stand down." 2 or 3 of the hunched veterans began to weep. "You lie," said Lund, stepping forward. "I do not. Surrender your weapons, and I promise you will be treated fairly and with respect." Will we get medals?" the bearded man asked in a quavering voice. The gratitude of the God Emperor will be with you always." More were weeping now, out of fear, anxiety, or plain relief. "Don't trust him," said Traves. "It's another trick." "I saw you in my bar," said Lund, stepping forward. "You came in looking." Her voice was empty, distant. "I saw you on the tannery roof, Omin Lund. You're still a fine shot, despite the hand." She looked down at her prosthetic with a wince of shame. "Will we get medals?" the bearded man repeated, eagerly. Traves turned on him. "Of course we won't, Spake, you cretin. He's here to kill us." "I'm not," I began. "I want medals!" The bearded man, Spake, screamed suddenly, sliding his las pistol up from his belt with the fluid speed only a trained soldier can manage. I had no choice. His shot tore through the shoulder padding of my storm coat. My bolt exploded his head, spraying blood across the rusty metal eagle on the wall. Pandemonium. The veterans leapt to their feet, firing wildly, scattering, running. I threw myself flat as shots tore out the wall plaster behind me. At some point, Fishig and Midas burst in, weapons blazing. I saw 3 or 4 veterans drop, sliced through by silent needles, and another 6 tumble as shotgun rounds blew them apart. Traves came down the aisle, blasting his old service-issue las rifle at me. I rolled and fired, but my shot went wide. His face distorted as a needle round punched through it, and he fell in a crumpled heap. Rex and her fire teams exploded in. Flames from some spilled accelerants billowed up the wall. I got up, and then was thrown back by a las shot that blew off my left hand. Spinning, falling, I saw Lund, struggling to make her prosthetic fingers work the unmodified trigger of Traves' lasgun. My bolt round hit her with such force she flew back down the aisle, hit the wall, and tore the Imperial Aquila down. Not a single veteran escaped the Guildhall alive. The firefight raged for 2 hours. Rex lost 5 men to the experienced guns of the Sameter 9th Veterans. They stood to the last. No more can be said of any Imperial Guard unit. The whole affair left me sour and troubled. I have devoted my life to the service of the Imperium, to protect it against its manifold foes, inside and out. But not against its servants. However misguided, they were loyal and true. However wrong, they were shaped that way by the service they had endured in the Emperor's name. Lund cost me my hand. A hand for a hand. They gave me a prosthetic on Sameter. I never used it. For 2 years I made do with a fused stump. Surgeons on Messina finally gave me a fully functional graft. I consider it still a small price to pay for them. I have never been back to Sameter. Even today, they are still finding the secreted, hidden bodies. So very many, dead in the Emperor's name. That was Missing in Action by Dan Abnett. Read by Toby Longworth. Backcloth for a Crown Additional. Written by Dan Abnett. Read by Toby Longworth. Lord Freuger, much to everyone's dismay, including, I'm sure, his own, was dead. It was a dry summer morning in 355.M41, and I was taking breakfast with Elizabeth Beckwin on the terrace of Spayton House when I received the news. The sky was a blurry blue, the colour of Sameter ware porcelain, and down in the bay the water was a pale lilac, shot through with glittering frills of silver. Sand doves warbled from the drowsy shade of the estate orchards. Jubal Kircher, my craggy, dependable chief of household security, came out into the day's heat from the garden room, apologized courteously for interrupting our private meal, and handed me a folded square of thin transmission paper. "Trouble?" asked Beckwin, pushing aside her dish of ploying crepes. "Freuger's dead," I replied, studying the missive. "Freuger who?" "Lord Freuger, of House Freuger." "You knew him?" "Very well. I would count him as a friend. Well, how very miserable. Dead at 82. That's no age. Was he ill? Beckwin asked. No. Ain Froigre was, if anything, maddeningly robust and healthy. Not a scrap of augmetics about him. You know the sort. I made this remark pointedly. My career had not been kind to my body. I had been repaired, rebuilt, augmented, and generally sewn back together more times than I cared to remember. I was a walking testimonial to Imperial Medicae reconstruction surgery. Elizabeth, on the other hand, still looked like a woman in her prime, a beautiful woman at that, and only the barest minimum of Juvenat work had preserved her so. According to this, he died following a seizure at his home last night. His family are conducting thorough investigations, of course, but... I drummed my fingers on the tabletop. Foul play. He was an influential man. Such men have enemies. And friends, I said. I handed her the communiqué. That's why his widow has requested my assistance. But for my friendship with Ain, I'd have turned the matter down. Elizabeth had only just arrived on Gudrun after an absence of almost 18 months, and would be gone again in a week, so I had resolved to spend as much time with her as possible. The operational demands of the distaff, based on Messina, kept her away from my side far more than I would have liked. But this was important, and Lady Froigre's plea too distraught to ignore. I'll come with you, Elizabeth suggested. I feel like a jaunt in the country. She called for a staff car to be brought round from the stable block, and we were on our way in under an hour. Philippe Gabon, one of Kirsch's security detail, acted as our driver. He guided the car up from Spaten on a whisper of thrust and laid in a course for Menizere. Soon we were cruising southwest over the forest tracks and the verdant cultivated belt outside d'Orsay and leaving the Insume headland behind. In the comfortable, climate-controlled rear cabin of the staff car, I told Elizabeth about Froigre. There have been Froigres on Gudrun since the days of the first colonies. Their house is one of the 26 venerables, that is to say, one of the 26 original noble fiefs, and as such has an hereditary seat in the upper legislature of the planetary government. Other newer houses have considerably more power and land these days, but nothing can quite eclipse the prestige of the venerables. Houses like Froigre, Sangral, Messian, and Glor. She smiled impishly at my inclusion of that last name. So, power, land, prestige, a honey trap for rivals and enemies. Did your friend have any? I shrugged. I brought with me several data slates Sullus had looked out for me from the library. They contained heraldic ledgers, family histories, biographies and memoirs, and very little that seemed pertinent. House Froigre vied with House Athensay and House Brudish in the early years of Gudrun, but that's literally ancient history. Besides, House Brudish became extinct after another feud with House Pariti 800 years ago. Ain's grandfather famously clashed with Lord Sangral and the then Governor Lord Dougray over the introduction of founding levy in the 190s, but that was just political, though Dougray never forgave him and later snubbed him by making Richtian Chancellor. In recent times, House Froigre has been very much a quiet, solid traditional seat in the legislature. No feuds that I know of. In fact, there hasn't been an inter-house war on Gudrun for 7 generations. They all play nicely together these days, do they? She asked. Pretty much. One of the things I like about Gudrun is that it's so damned civilized. Too damn civilized, she admonished. One day, Gregor, one day, this place will lull you into such a deep sense of tranquil seclusion that you'll be caught with your pants down. I hardly think so. It's not complacency, before you jump down my throat. Gudrun, Spaten House itself, is just a safe place. A sanctuary, given my line of work. Your friend's still dead, she reminded me. I sat back. He liked to live well. Good food, fine wines. He could drink nail under the table. No, I'm not joking. 5 years ago, at the wedding of Ain's daughter, I was invited, and I took Harlan along as I don't know what, actually. You weren't around, and I didn't want to go alone. Harlan started bending his lordship's ear with tales of bounty hunting, and the last I saw of them, they were sprinting their way down their 4th bottle of anise at 5 in the morning. Ain was up at 9 the next day to see his daughter off. Nell was still asleep at 9 the following day. She grinned. So, a life of great appetites may have just caught up with him. Perhaps, though you'd think that would have shown up on the Medicae Mortis's report. So you do suspect foul play? I can't shake that idea. I was silent for a few minutes, and Elizabeth scrolled her way through several of the slates. House Freuger's main income was from mercantile dealings. They hold a 12-point stock in Braid on Sai and a 15% share in Helicon Subsid Shipping. What about trade rivals? We'd have to expand our scope off-planet. I suppose assassination is possible, but that's a strange way to hit back at a trade rival. I'll have to examine their records. If we can turn up signs of a clandestine trade fight, then maybe assassination is the answer. Your friend spoke out against the Ophidian campaign. So did his father. Neither believed it was appropriate to divert funds and manpower into a war of reconquest in the subsector next door, when there was so much to put in order on the home front. I was just wondering, she said. Wonder away, but I think that's a dead end. The Ophidian War's long since over and done with, and I don't think anyone cares what Ain thought about it. So, you have got a theory? Only the obvious ones. None of them with any substantiating data. An internecine feud, targeting Ain from inside the family. A murder driven by some secret affair of the heart. A darker conspiracy that remains quite invisible for now. Or too much good living, in which case we'll be home before nightfall. Freuger Hall, the ancestral pile of the noble House Freuger, was a splendid stack of ivy-swathed oozelight and copper tiles overlooking the Vale of Feig, 10 kilometres south of Menizere. Water meadows sloped back from the river, becoming wildflower pastures that climbed through spinneys of larch and fintel to hem the magnificent planned gardens of the house. Geometric designs of box hedge, trim lawn, flowering beds and symmetrical ponds. Beyond the sandy drive, darkened woods came right down to skirt the back of the great hall, except for where a near-perfect sullock lawn had been laid. Ain and I had spent several diverting afternoons there, playing against each other. A kilometre north of the house, the gnarled stone finger of the Folly rose from the ascending woods. "Where to put down, sir?" Gabon asked over the intercom. "On the drive in front of the portico, if you'd be so kind." "What's been going on here?" Elizabeth asked as we came in lower. She pointed. The lawn areas nearest to the hall were littered with scraps of rubbish, paper waste and glittery bits of foil. Some sections of grass were flat and yellow, as if compressed and starved of light. Tiny stones, whipped up by our downwash, ticked off the car's bodywork as we settled in to land. "Oh, my dear Gregor!" Lady Frail Freuger almost fell into my arms. I had held her in a comforting embrace for a few patient moments as she sobbed against my chest. "Forgive me," she said suddenly, pulling away and dabbing her eyes with a black lace handkerchief. "This is all so very terrible, so very, very terrible." "My deepest sympathies for your loss, lady," I said, feeling awkward. A houseman, his arm banded in black, had led us into a stateroom off the main hall where Lady Freuger was waiting. The blinds were drawn, and morning tapers had been lit, filling the air with a feeble light and a sickly perfume. Frail Freuger was a stunning woman in her late 60s. Her lush red hair, almost flame pink it was so bright, pulled back and pinned down under a veil quiff of jet scamisquire. Her grief gown was slate epinshire, the sleeves ending in delicate interwoven gloves, so that not one speck of her flesh was uncovered. I introduced Elizabeth, who murmured her condolences, and Lady Freuger nodded. Then she suddenly looked flustered. "Oh, my, where are my manners? I should have the staff bring refreshments for you and—" "Hush, lady," I said, taking her arm and walking her down the long room into the soft shade of the shutters. "You have enough on your mind. Grief is enough. Tell me what you know, and I will do the rest." "You're a good man, sir. I knew I could trust you." She paused and waited while her current racks subsided. "Ain died just before midnight last night. A seizure. It was quick, the physician said." "What else did he say, lady?" She drew a data wand from her sleeve and handed it to me. "It's all here." I plucked out my slate and plugged it in. the display lit up with the stored files. Death by tremorous palpitations of the heart and mind. A dysfunction of the spirit. According to the Medicae's report, Ain Freuger had died because of a spasm in his anima. This means... I paused. Nothing. Who is your physician? Generous Notil, of Menizere. He has been the family Medicae since the time of Ain's grandfather. His report is rather non-specific, lady. Could I present the body for a further examination? I've already done that, she said softly. The surgeon at Menizere General who attended said the same. My husband died of terror. Terror? Yes, Inquisitor. Now, tell me that isn't the work of the infernal powers. There had, she told me, been a celebration. A grand fete. Ain's eldest son, Rinton, had returned home 2 weeks before, having mustered out of his service in the Imperial Guard. Rinton Freuger had been a captain in the 50th Gudronite and seen 6 years' service in the Ophidian subsector. Such was his father's delight on his return, a fete was called, a carnival feast. Travelling players from all around the canton had attended, along with troops of musicians, acrobats, armies of stall-holders, entertainers, and hundreds of folk from the town. That explained the litter and faded patches on the lawn. Tent pitches. The scars of marquees. Had he any enemies? I asked, pacing the shuttered room. Not that I know of. I would like to review his correspondence. Diaries, too, if he kept them. I see. I don't believe he kept a diary, but our rubricator will have a list of correspondence. On the top of the harpsichord was a framed portrait, a hololith of Ain Freuger, smiling. I picked it up and studied it. The last portrait of him, she said, taken at the fete. My last connection with him. Where did he die? The Folly, said Lady Freuger. He died in the Folly. The woods were damp and dark. Boughs creaked in the late afternoon wind. An odd bird-song thrilled from the shadows. The Folly was a stone drum capped by a slate needle. Inside it was bare and terribly musty. Sand doves fluttered up in the roof spaces. Cobwebs glazed the bare windows. This is where I found him, said a voice from behind me. I turned. Rinton Freuger stooped in under the doorframe. He was a well-made boy of 25, with his mother's lush red hair. His eyes had a curious, hooded aspect. Rinton? Sir? He bowed slightly. Was he dead when you found him? No, Inquisitor. He was laughing and talking. He liked to come up here. He loved the Folly. I came up to thank him for the fate he had thrown in my honour. We were talking together when suddenly he went into convulsions. Just minutes later, before I could summon help, he was dead. I didn't know Rinton Freuger well, though his service record was very respectable, and I knew his father had been proud of him. Ain had never mentioned any animosity from his son, but in any noble house there is always the spectre of succession to consider. Rinton had been alone with his father at the time of death. He was a seasoned soldier, undoubtedly no stranger to the act of killing. I kept an open mind, literally. Even without any invasive mental probing, it is possible for a psionic of my ability to sense surface thoughts. There was no flavour of deceit about Rinton's person, though I could feel carefully contained loss and the tingle of trepidation. Small wonder, I considered. Uncommon are the citizens of the Imperium who do not register anxiety at being quizzed by an inquisitor of the Holy Ordos. There was no point pressing him now. Rinton's story might easily be put to the test with an auto-seance, during which psychometric techniques would simply reveal the truth of his father's last moments to me. Rinton walked me back to the hall and left me to my ponderings in Ain's study. It was as he had left it, I was told. The room was half-panelled and lined, for the most part, with glazed shelves of neatly bound books and data slates. Discreet glow globes hovered around the edges of the room at head height, set to a low luminosity, and a selection of scroll-backed couches and overstuffed chairs were arranged in front of the high-throated ceramic fireplace with its wood-burning fusion stove. The desk, under the diamond-paned west windows, was a wide crescent of polished duralloy, floated a metre off the carpet by passive suspensor pods. The desk was clean and bare. I sat at it, depressing slightly the hydraulics of the writing chair. I was half a head taller than Ain Freuger. I studied the mirror-smooth, slightly raked surface of the desk. There was no sign of any control panel, but a gentle wave of my hand across it woke up heat-sensitive touch plates engraved into the duralloy's finish. I touched a few, but they needed Ain's touch. Probably a combination of palm print and gene key to unlock them. That, or Inquisition-grade software. I unpinned my inquisitorial rosette, which I had been wearing on the sternum of my black leather coat, and slid open the signal port. Holding it low over the desk, I force-fed the touch plates with several magenta-level security override programs. It gave up the fight almost at once, opening systems without even the need for passwords. Built into the stylish desk, an item of furniture that had clearly cost Ain a lot of money, was a fairly powerful cogitator, a Vox-picked uplink, a message archive, 2 filing archives, and a master control for the simple, limited electronic systems built into the hall. Separate pages of each file and message could be displayed as a facsimile on the blotter plate, and a touch of a finger turned them or put them away. Ain had destroyed all paper records. I played with it for some time, but the most interesting thing I found was a log of invoices for services provided at the fete, and a list of the invitations. I copied both into my own data slate. Elizabeth and Gabon arrived when I was busy with that. Elizabeth had been interviewing the household staff, and Gabon had been out, walking the grounds. "There were over 900 guests here, sir," he said, "and maybe another 500 players, musicians, entertainers, and carnival folk." "Where from?" "Menizere, mostly," he replied. "Local entertainers, a few troubadours and some street tumblers from the bi-weekly textile market. The biggest individual groups were Calakin's company, an acclaimed troupe of travelling actors, and Sunsible's touring fair, who provided the games and rides and diversions." I nodded. Gabon was as thorough as usual. A short, spare man in his 150s, with cropped black hair and a bushy moustache. He had been with the d'Orsay Arbites for about 70 years before retiring into private service. He wore a simple, refined, dark blue suit that had been ingeniously tailored to hide the fact that he was wearing a handgun in a shoulder rig. "What about you?" I asked Elizabeth. She sat down on one of the couches. "Nothing scintillating. The staff seemed genuinely shocked and upset at the death. They all react with outrage at the idea your friend might have had any enemies." "It seems quite clear to me that he did have some," I said. Elizabeth reached into the folds of her gown and fished out a small, hard object. She tossed it across onto the desktop, and it landed with a tap. There it extended 4 multi-jointed limbs and scurried across onto my palm. I turned the wriggling poison snooper over and pressed the recessed stud on its belly. A little ball of hololithic energy coalesced above its head-mounted projector, and I read it as it slowly scrolled around on its own axis. Traces of Low, Obscura, and several other Class 2 and 3 narcotics in the garden area and the staff quarters. Penshell seed traces found in the stable block. More Low, as well as Listeria and E. coli in small amounts in the kitchen section. Elizabeth shrugged. The usual mix of recreational drugs one might expect. None in large quantities, and the kitchen's as hygienic as anywhere. You'd probably get the same sort of readings from Spayton House. Probably. Penshell seeds. They're quite unusual. "A very mild stimulant," said Gabon. "I didn't know anyone still used that stuff. Time was it was the drug of choice in the artists' quarter of d'Orsay, back when I was on the force. The seeds are dried, rolled, and smoked in pipes. A little bohemian. An old man's smoke. Most of the outdoor traces can be put down to the visiting entertainers," I mused. "Plus a little off-duty pleasure from the staff or loose-living guests. What about the stable block? Are any of Freuger's ostlers Penshell smokers?" Elizabeth shook her head. They cleared large parts of the stable area to provide spaces for the fair stall holders. I put the snooper down on the desk, and it wriggled back and forth for a few moments until it got enough purchase to right itself. So, nothing untoward, in fact. And certainly no significant toxins.
None at all, said Elizabeth.
Damn. Given the description of Aine's death, I had been quite sure poison was the key. Perhaps some assassin's sophisticated toxin that had not shown up on the initial Medicaid report. But Elizabeth's snooper was high-grade and thorough.
What do we do now? She asked.
I passed her my data slate. Send the contents of this to Amos by direct Vox link. See what he can come up with. Uber Amos was my ancient and trusted savant. If anyone could see a pattern or make a connection, it was him. Evening fell. I went outside, alone. I felt annoyed and frustrated. In fact, I felt thwarted. I'd come there as a favour to my old friend's widow, offering my services, and in most respects I was overqualified. I was an Imperial Inquisitor, and this was most likely just a job for the local Arbites. I had expected to have the entire matter sewn up in a few hours, to settle things swiftly in a quick, unofficial investigation, and leave with the thanks of the family for sparing them a long, drawn-out inquest. But the clues just weren't there. There was no motive, no obvious antagonist, no aggressor, but it still seemed likely that Aine Freuger had been killed. I looked at the Medicaid report again, hoping to find something that would establish natural causes. Nothing. Someone had taken my friend's life. But I couldn't tell what or who, or why. The evening skies were dark, stained a deep violet, and smeared with chasing milky clouds. An early moon shone, passing behind the running trails of cloud every minute or so. A wind was gathering, and the stands of trees beside the lawn were beginning to sway and swish. The leaves made a cold sound, like rain. I walked over to my flyer, popped the cargo trunk, and took out Barbarisata. I slowly freed it from its silk bindings and drew the long, gleaming blade from its machined scabbard. Barbarisata had been an heirloom sword, a psychically attuned weapon from the forges of distant Carthay, and slaved to the minds of the generations of warrior women who had wielded it. Enhancing its strength with pentagrammic wards, I had used the long sabre in my battle against the heretic Quixos, during which struggle it had been broken below the tip. Master swordsmiths had remade the blade from the broken main portion, creating a shorter, straighter blade by rounding off and edging the break and reducing the hilt. A good deal smaller than its old self, now more a single-handed rapier than a hand-and-a-half sabre, it was still a potent weapon. Naked in my hand, it hummed and whined as my mind ran through it and made it resonate. The incised wards glowed and sobbed out faint wisps of smoke. I walked out over the grass under the seething trees, holding the blade out before me like a dowsing rod, sweeping the scene, letting the blade tip slide along the invisible angles of space. Twice, on my circuit of the lawns, it twitched, as if tugged by sprite hands, but I could discern nothing from the locations. But there was something there. My first hint of a malign focus. My first hint that not only was foul play involved, but that Lady Freuger might be right. Though they had only left the slightest traces behind them, infernal powers had been at work here. Elizabeth came into my room at 8 the next morning. She woke me by sitting down on the side of my bed and handed me a cup of hot black caffeine as I roused. She was already dressed and ready for work. The day was bright. I could hear the household coming to life, pans clattering in the kitchen block, and the butler calling to his pages in the nearby gallery.
"Bad storm in the night," she said. "Brought trees down."
"Really?" I grumbled, sitting up and sipping the sweet, dark caffeine. I looked at her. It wasn't like Bequin to be so perky this early. "Out with it," I said. She handed me a data slate. "Amos has been busy. Must have worked all night. Through the storm." There was no storm up his way. It was local. I didn't really hear that reply. I was caught up in a close reading of the slate. Failing to cross-match just about every detail I had sent him, Amos had clearly become bored. The list of guests I had sent him had led to nothing, despite his best efforts to make connections. The caterers and performers had revealed nothing either. No links to the underworld or cult activity, no misdeeds or priors. except for the usual clutch of innocent and minor violations one might expect. One of the travelling actors had been charged with a fray 20 years before, and another had done time for grievous wounding, that sort of thing. The only item that had flagged any sort of connection was the description of Ain Freuger's death. Amos had only turned to that rather vague clue once he'd exhausted all others. In the past 20 months, 11 people in the Drunner region of Gudrun, which is to say the coastal area encompassing Menizere, D'Orsay, and Insium, all the way to Medua Chapeltown, had died of a similar mystery ailment. Only a tight, deliberate search like the one Amos had conducted would have shown up such a connection, given the scale of area involved and the size of population. Listed together, the deaths stood out like a sore thumb. Here, Amos had come into his own. Another clerk might have sent those findings to me and waited for direction, but Amos, hungry to answer the questions himself, had pressed on, trying to make a pattern out of them. No simple task. There was nothing to demographically or geographically link the victims. A housewife here, a mill-keeper there, a landowner in one small village, a community doctor in another, 70 kilometers away. The only thing they had in common was the sudden, violent, and inexplicable nature of their demises. Seizures, abrupt, fatal. I set down my cup and scrolled on, aware that Elizabeth was grinning at me. "Get to the last bit," she advised. "Amos strikes again." Right at the last, Amos revealed another connection. A day or two before each death, the victim's locality had been paid a visit by Sunsible's touring fair. Lady Freuger was most perturbed to see us about to leave. "There are questions here still," she began. "And I'm going to seek the answers," I said. "Trust me, I believe my savant has hit upon something." She nodded, unhappy. Rinton stepped forward and put his arm around his mother's shoulders. "Trust me," I repeated, and walked out across the drive to my waiting flyer. I could hear the sound of chain blades, and turned from the car to walk around the side of the hall. One of the trees brought down in the night's freak storm had crushed part of the stable block, and the housemen were working to saw up the huge trunk and clear it. "Is that where you detected Penchel seed?" I asked Elizabeth when she came to find out what was keeping me. "Yes," she said. "Fetch my blade." I called the housemen away from their work and walked into the collapsed ruin of the stable, crunching over heaps of coarse sawdust. The ivy-clad tree still sprawled through the burst roof. Elizabeth brought me Barbarisata, and I drew it quickly. By then Lady Freuger and Rinton Freuger had emerged to see what I was doing. Barbarisata hummed in my hand, louder and more throatily than it had done the previous night. As soon as I entered that part of the stable block, the particular stall the tree had smashed, it jumped. The taste of chaos was here. "What was this used for?" I asked. "During the fete? What was this area used for?" "Storage," said Lady Freuger. "The people from the fair wanted to keep equipment and belongings out of sight. Food, too, I think. One man had trays of fresh figs he wanted to keep out of the light." "And the hololithographer," said Rinton. "He used one of those stalls as a darkroom." So, how do you find a travelling fair in an area the size of the Drunner region? If you have a copy of their most recent invoice, it's easy. The fairmaster, eager to be paid for his services at Freuger Hall, had left as a payment address an inn 80 kilometres away in Seabrud. From the invoice, I saw that Ain had been asked to mail the payment within 5 days. The fair moved around a great deal, and the travelling folk didn't believe much in the concept of credit accounts. From Seabrud, we got a fix on the location of Sunsible's fair. They had pitched on a meadow outside the village of Brudmartin, a little rustic community of ket herds and weavers that was flanked by a lush, deciduous woodland hillside to the east and marshy, cattle-tramped fields below at the river spill to the west. It was late afternoon on a hot, close day, the air edged with the heavy, fulminous threat of storms. The sky was dark overhead, but the corn was bright and golden down in the meadows, and pollen balls blew in the breeze like thistle fibres. Grain crakes whooped in the corn stands, and small warblers of the most intense blue darted across the hedges.